Hello, everyone. So my name is Yuk Hui. Thank you for being here. I know it's quite late for some of you and quite early for some of you as well. So welcome to the 8th edition of the research seminar, Dialogues on Philosophy and Technology. So today I have the great pleasure to welcome Luciana Parisi to be our guest and to discuss with us today on the question of computation, philosophy of technology, and so on. So let me briefly introduce Luciana. I think most of you already know her. It is her work. So I met Luciana quite a long time ago at Goldsmiths College in London when she was a professor there. And later she also became one of the examiners of my PhD a long time ago. Currently, Luciana is a professor at the program in literature and computational media arts and culture at the Duke University. As I said before, she was at Goldsmiths for quite a long time. Her research is a philosophical investigation of technology in culture, aesthetics, and politics. She was a member of the legendary CCRU Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, and currently a co-founding member of the Critical Computation Bureau, together with Tiziana Terranova and other colleagues. She's the author of Abstract Sex, Philosophy, Biotechnology, and the Mutations of Design, published in 2004 by Continuum, and Contagious Architecture, Computation, Aesthetics, and Space, published in 2013 by the MIT Press. And now she's completing a monograph on alien epistemologies and the transformation of logical thinking in computation. And today, Luciana suggests to discuss with us a subject titled Instrumentality and the Possibility. So what we are going to do, as some of you know already, Luciana is going to talk about this subject, and then later on we are going to have a dialogue. And after the dialogue, we will open the questions to the public. So so thank you, Luciana. So.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. And whenever, I think it's very fun to remember those times that we met at Goldsmiths. There was very productive times, and I am really fond of our conversations, and I'm really glad that we are still in conversation after all this time. And I always feel that I can learn so much from when I read your work, and I have a highly respect for the way you continue to challenge this question of computation, of the digital, of cybernetics, and maintain this kind of tension between philosophy and technology, which it's also, of course, as you know, one of my cracks. So I'm going to talk today. I'm going to share some of my thoughts. This is part of a few projects that I've been working on recently. There's few publications. This paper today is inspired to, but there's also more there that is waiting to come forward, and I will really welcome your comments. I'm looking forward to this dialogue. So to start with, I've entitled this talk Instrumentality Possibility from inspired to a course that I just finished teaching at Duke, a postgraduate course, where the challenge is to try and think instrumentality outside, within, and also against the kind of legacy of a critique of instrumentality and of instrumental reason as developed by the Frankfurt School and around the Second World War and in the work of the dialectic of alignment by Adorno and Horkheimer, and in relation to its kind of problematization and antipathy towards this question, this idea, this method really of instrumentality as developed by American pragmatism, especially the work of John Dewey, but also to some extent Charles Sanders Peirce, and the way this kind of critique of instrumentality, of instrumental reason, has entered a kind of dominant representation, manifestation within a contemporary critical theory of technology, especially for those of us who work with questioning the possibility of the digital object or computational system or a system, systems or the approach to knowledge or epistemology in terms of the system or the systemic today. So my work recently has been following this line of legacy of this kind of critique, this kind of legacy of the critique of instrumental reason that is very much present in our approach to contemporary critique of technology. And my work therefore starts from a question as to how and why the critique of instrumental reason maintains this prominent scene within the landscape of debates about what computation is, what it could be, what are the social-political possibility of reconfiguring or questioning the pillars of modern knowledge and modern epistemology. And so this kind of ambivalent role that technology has within the contemporary culture is something that is obviously of great interest to me. So I'm just gonna go and look at some of this, read some of this material that I have prepared for you, and then we go for discussion. So instrumentality, I understand as generally as a method of correlation between means and ends. And as such, I think it is a method that can contribute to question the assumed correlation between technology and philosophy. And I hope that this can become clear as I talk through. Instrumentality is generally understood in terms of the critique of instrumental reason and in contemporary debates about how intelligent automation maintains, a kind of dominant role into in relation to critical thinking. So in particular, once instrumentality is, I would like to, once I think instrumentality can be considered through John Dewey's suggestion and work, especially essay in experimental, essay in I can't remember the title, no, sorry. It is possible to challenge the perspective of instrumental reason by questioning the assumption that with industrial and informational capitalism, the medium replaces critical thinking and the datum replaces the ideatum. Instead of an equivalence between the datum and the ideatum, with Dewey, one can argue that data and ideas rather both stem from instrumentality or mediations as mode of elaboration of thinking practices that one can see as being both immanent and transcendental. By thinking of instrumentality through John Dewey, which I will clarify a little bit in a second, the premise of thinking of instrumentality not as a mean to an end, but in terms of its immanence and transcendentality, is a way to think of means as in terms of how thinking happens and how thinking practices can transform the very condition of what happens. So how the thinking practices can transform the very condition of what happens. And therefore challenging the way in which instrumentality has been defined primarily in binary terms of use, usability versus uselessness. So my point is that the instrumental reason and the critique of instrumental reason is still lodged in this binary, in this dyad, or in this kind of convenient model of mirroring what is usable, what is usable in relation to what instead is useless. So with Dewey, I've tried in some of my work that I've published elsewhere to envision a thinking as instrumental to an environment and not as an ontological constitutive of self-determination or self-posing or self-decision, which is based on the binaries of telos and the medium. Instead, instrumentality defines thought or intelligence by function, by what is carried on, by the bearing of the process as it unfolds in the practice. So instrumentality is the bearing of the process as it unfolds in the practice. So in these terms, does not start with a power. So is not an entity or a substance or an activity which is ready-made or which constitutes the world. Instead, for Dewey, knowledge and thinking as leading to knowledge results from the discernment or the articulation of possible correlations between events and processes of change. From this standpoint, ideas are not an ontology, are not a thing, but they are not, neither are given categories or eternal forms, but are instruments of orientation in the world. Specifically, ideas for Dewey are plans of actions and are predictors of future events. An idea, therefore, is also a way to retroactive reflect on effects from mediation, insofar as the latter, i.e. mediation, the very practice of mediation, orientates thought towards a futurity that has no image, a futurity that has not been thought already, that is not prescribed as the total sum of chronological sequences or individual sets. From this standpoint, instrumentality as this plan of action, a predictor, and as an activity that is not given, can offer us a possibility to open up a dialogue of technology philosophy where one could argue that the correlation between means and ends at the core of debates about, for instance, artificial intelligence today, can be unearthed or disentangled or unhinged from the critique of instrumentality or instrumental reason. The question is, how can an instrument be there for others without reproducing the blueprint it was designed for? How can instrumentality disrupt the violence of the original judgment that decides what is useful from what is useless? How, in other words, can the medium be other than what it is programmed to do, that is other than its use and usability, which otherwise leaves the medium to a soulless existence? If the central pillar of instrumentality is used for an end, it is because instrumentality is determined by a principle of uselessness. It's because instrumentality is always already caught in the dyad with the conceiving of the mean as being an empty mean without end, which indeed I want to suggest confers to machines an always already status of surrogacy in the world of man. When artificial intelligence today appears in the discursive circuits, for instance, of transhumanism and posthumanism, it carries with it this fundamental paradox. this mirror of use and uselessness, embedded in the structure of meaning, where the syntactical functions are only there to sustain the symbolic representation of man. If transhumanism holds on the usability of AI to render man's consciousness equally superior to all creatures, posthumanism rather turns the uselessness of machines into a potential platform whereby humans and machines are made equivalent, and so are all other creatures. The paradox of instrumentality here continues to be preserved in the continuous polymorphous variation of what can be human, as this variation expands use and usability to a point of absolute impossibility or negation or uselessness. In other words, use and usability cannot stand alone without the ground, without the matter of uselessness, which is constantly referred to in order to justify why man needs to give semantic meaning, meaning, existence, and history to machines. So what I'm saying here is that instrumentality is, despite the kind of premise that Dewey is offering us, nonetheless, I agree that instrumentality is enfolded in the modern myth of Prometheus. The technological emancipation of man is continuous with the program of colonial capitalism, whose logic of accumulation turns uselessness, enslaved populations, into use through ownership, abstraction, and extraction of what is deemed to be a valueless value in the construction of a global map of the modern empire. Instrumentality, therefore, cannot be disentangled from what Lisa Law in the book, The Intimacy of the Four Continents, calls the colonial archive, defining the global processing of numbers, measurements, statistics, strategies, classifications, and what she calls an imperial technology of colonial imperialism and governance. The integrated circuit of this infinite usability, this infinite capacity of use of the enslaved population is what connects the Promethean myth to the colonial archive and constitutes what Cedric Robinson calls the racial capitalism, whereby modern liberalism defined the human and universalized its attributes to European men, while it simultaneously differentiated populations in the colonies as less than human. However, as much as instrumentality has become the modern motor of what Sylvia Wynter calls recursive epistemology, I want to suggest that it's also preserved within itself the alienness of uselessness, the non-human, inhuman, less than human condition that are not always are to be preserved in order to reproduce the original condition of surrogacy in what are defined as mindless machines. As instrumentality becomes part of man's project of transcendental reason, one can argue that it is also part of what Sylvia Wynter calls cosmogony, or the origin story of modern knowledge. The overrepresentation of modern cosmogony, I suggest, already includes the myth of Prometheus, the autopoietic creator and maker of the world. Prometheus promises human progress against the organic decay of man and guarantees the extension of reason through the rationality of the colonial archive. Prometheus gives man a future that can free him from the useless darkness of the unknown. What Prometheus promises is a continuation of modern metaphysics by other means, where the servomechanic mediatic condition of useless enslaved labor is also, can also be understood as flesh, as servomechanic flesh that animates, fuels the Promethean myth. But servomechanic flesh, or what I've also called techno-flesh, I intend the material matrix whose extraction and abstraction of energy in the capital circuit of value is used to justify the racialization of knowledge and the speciation of the human. This is a mode of absolute enslavement that sustains colonial violence in the universality of cultural differences under which Promethean capitalism promised to save whole humanity. However, the historical reconfiguration of capitalist slavery showed that it's precisely the servomechanic intelligence that has been systematically neglected, dismissed, and abandoned in critical accounts of the social reproduction of capital, which have fundamentally seen machines through the lenses of use and usability, that is, in terms of their uselessness. This is what sets the limits of the transformation of both philosophy and technology, insofar as debates about machine intelligence today confirm the tropes of this fundamental dyad of use and uselessness when machines are addressed as in terms of mindless efficiencies, non-conscious functionality, meaningless language, and causeless decision. For the coupling of means and ends at the core of instrumentality is constitutive of the autopoietic principle of self-making, caught within the telos or usefulness and uselessness. Since autopoiesis entails a principle of organization that is set to preserve energy in evolving systems, it also maintains an entropic principle of accumulation and discharge. As such, autopoiesis is a pillar of capital slavery, namely the circuitry of value extracted from slavery coincide with the incorporation, by which I mean the dyad of inclusion and exclusion, of charge and discharge, of energy that must grant the survival and evolution of the man system. This is the energy value circuit that measures energy that is otherwise deemed to be useless. As the Promethean entanglement of computation and colonialism continues to preserve and diversify slavery in the form of surrogate labor or human machines in the global south, for instance, just think of mechanical Turks, it also continues to expand the condition of what Jasper Poir calls slow death everywhere. Automated reason distributes the brutality of recursive epistemology at all levels of living by constantly rescripting results towards one and the same output. It is not a surprise that today chatbots can only have conversations that confirm the epistemological fixities of categories that match names, jobs, hairstyles with biased concepts of race, gender, sexuality, and class. On the other side, however, on the other side of instrumentality, the side where instrumentality above all coincides with thinking functions that are not predetermined, that is where they are not executors of ideas, there is a possibility of starting with the servomechanic flesh itself. What does it mean if we were to start our conversation between philosophy and technology from the negative negation or the uselessness of what can be just a mean to an end, i.e. a woman, a refugee, a migrant, a homeless, a queer, or blackness? What carries, i.e. the marker of the double excluded from the dyadic logic of the inclusive excluded or the other. In other words, to overturn the teleological enframing of the universal myth of Prometheus, the servomechanic flesh can be here taken has been always already generative of breaks within the dominant cosmogony of man. Today, I want to discuss with you as to how, and open up the discussion, how to offer alternative epistemology that start from the know-hows, i.e. from the practices of knowing that are already technicity, functions, rules, syntactical relations, processing that hack back the premises of onto-epistemological knowledge rooted at the core of modernity. While it is not possible to go back to a pre-capitalist, pre-colonial, pre-global spatio-temporality, there is also a possibility of unleashing alienness from within this monotonic representation of the cosmogony of man, from engaging with practices, a praxis of fugitivity that have run through the plotting, i.e. the alien generation of know-hows, of functions and operation that servomechanic instrumentality have run continuously beneath the standardization of use and usability of machines. The point is not to maintain the significance of uselessness or to promote the design of useless technology or useless digital object or even art object that refuse any use, but to suggest that while the critique of instrumentality is locked in this dyad, in this mirror stage of use and uselessness, human reason and mindless automation, or human dignity and inconclusive chains of endless effects in automated technology today, I think that the point is that one is to suspend this kind of critique that overlook the existence of techno-praxis that servomechanic flesh have brought forward and cultivated each and every time against and outside the violence of recursive colonialism. So in a way, our fixation with this dyad between how machines take away our human dignity, our human primary narcissism, is actually problematically caught in this in the model of recursive colonialism. From this standpoint, one can take the crisis of transcendental reason and the lament that automated intelligence is stripping away our transcendental imagination in cybernetic computational capitalism as a symptom. So the crisis, as I see the crisis as a symptom of an otherwise instrumentality, as already a rupture in the strata of teleological programming of the medium on behalf of the structure of power that Sylvia Winter understands as the bioeconomic success of man. These ruptures are already part, in other words, are already hacking, are already present in the monotonic formation of modern epistemology. In the way, as for instance, in notes on Black accelerationism, Ariadne suggests that Blackness is always already accelerationist, and that the concern with technology, or what she calls right and left accelerationism, involves always already a critique of humanism through Afrofuturism and Afro-pessimism, which she argues is attached to a struggle for and against humanism, which highlight the dissolution of subjectivity in the way that one can re-entangle technology and politics in the critique of capital. I just want to make a little parenthesis that I think this question of how Ariadne talks about Blackness as always already accelerationist reminds me also of how Zadia Jackson talks about Blackness as always already being part of plasticity in her argument with the concept of neuroplasticity that some have also been working on, for instance, Malabo, in the critique of technology. However, Ariadne argues that what remains overlooked in this critique of subjectivity is precisely what she calls the black non-subject, which has rather subtended the continuous process of primitive accumulation. What is missing in the critique of Afrofuturism is the black non-subject as the germinal history of racial capitalism, where the inhuman non-subject is already black and is not in search of reparation, of having to become human or having to justify its post-human relation with technology. She argues that the black non-subject does not fulfill this kind of Promethean model of alienation and liberation from capital. Above all, because the black non-subject can never and will never denote property, i.e. as not property of its own, right? The capitalist process of enslavement and dispossession and therefore impossibility of owning of personhood places blackness at the center of the apocalypse, of the crisis of of transcendental reason, and brings forward why the fear of automation as the end of the world profoundly challenges the cosmogony of man based on biocentric story of evolution and also a mathematical universality of formal reason. Here, black accelerationism becomes both, and quote, the agent of the world's demise and its inheritor, and end of quote. By placing a black radical thought at the core of accelerationism, Ariadne seems to speak to something that I was recently put to my attention, the work of James Boggs, who was a cybernetician and a black activist and abolitionism, who claim that automation will bring to an end the wide structure of labor. In his short essay, The Evolving Society, James Boggs talks about the enslaving plantation economy and cybernetics as developed in the form of the cotton gin. He argues that the development of the new machine, the cotton gin, imparted the demand for more labor. What he calls this labor cybernation, and he, end quote, he defines it as the automation of the nerve centers operated not by men, but by computing machines that are eliminating the need for what he calls Negro jobs. The automated machines, he suggests, is behind the move of what he calls Negro employment towards civil service and social service arena and teaching jobs. For Boggs, this meant that while and what he calls Negroes would be employed in technology jobs occupied by whites, they will nonetheless become central to the decision-making determining the final disposition of the results of technology. In this little article that I suggest you guys read, The Evolving Society, James Boggs seems to refer not only to what, for instance, Simon Dodd would call a technical mentality, the importance of cybernetics transforming the technical mentality, not just of the individual and machines, but of the whole social structure. But here it's interesting how to see how James Boggs also speaks to Simon Dodd's technical mentality in terms of a political mentality that accompanies the technical, to challenge the view of instrumentality as a servo-mechanic uselessness, as a kind of empty vessel to be programmed to an end. It is cybernetics as mentality and not just according to Boggs. As you read it, you can see that it is cybernetics as mentality and not how many white people can be technically trained that leads to the revolutionary path of cybernetics. He argues that those who are left outside technical employment as the last hired and the first fired can rather exercise their political power that breaks from American economic tradition. Boggs concludes that what he calls Negro are best equipped than whites to the mode of automation that is destroying the economic model that whites were used to. So I would take, so these are just some examples that I'm thinking with in order to unpack this kind of parallel conditions of servo-mechanic instrumentality that have broken from within the monotonic infrastructure of teleological modernity, of which we continue to leave the legacy both in its kind of governance, but also in the critique of this governance. Instrumentality, therefore, can become a possibility for what I've called in other places alienness, that is a praxis of spatio-temporality that are alien, that are posed at the very edge of the uselessness binary. As much as the myth of Prometheus appears to intensify the global speciation of knowledge, where the gendering, racializing, and sexualizing of automated thinking is there to mirror and to reify the self-determination of the modern subject across culture, so too, one could argue, intelligent automation has been challenging the very dignity of the human subject, of human reason, but falling short of fulfilling the universality of the manifest image of man. The common sense human life form, or simply what it means to be people in a world, or even to have a word, and this is what I mean by the manifest image, which is an idea that I draw from John Sellers, is already predicted on the cosmogony of man, for which there is only one people, only one word, only one techno-liberal word. Instrumentality instead may point to the break between the manifest image and the scientific image, where starting from synaptic conception of neurons or neural connection to junk and viral DNA, from quarks to Schrödinger equation, from computational learning to quantum particles, as well as from the mechanical reproduction of sound to software engineering of samples, the pillar of modern and ontoepistemology have been broken infinite times. As much as instrumentality defines the way at the core, or defines the core of modern philosophy, transcendental reason and transcendental imagination have been delivered to the scientific image through the capitalist industrial information rationality, there have also been irreversible possibility of otherwise imagination, sociality, and alien living. From this standpoint, one can argue, pace to the Frankfurt School, Martin Heidegger, and to some extent, I'm also referring to Bernard Stiegler, and to some extent also to Achille Member, who have argued against the new barbarism and the brutalism of the techno-scientific image that the ingression of information technology means into the teleological model of philosophy, only demonstrates a material differences in practices of knowing how and in the elaboration of alien reasoning that has rather exposed the man-machine equation of value to a generative reality of infinite numbering stemming from the techno-flesh, that is from information processing itself. So pace to the Frankfurt and the legacy of this critique of the new barbarism of techno-capital. Today, I want to suggest, together with Simon Don, that information is here rather to be understood as an allopoietic instrumentality, exposing its pattern complexity, its incomputable differential, its alien logical, syntactical, and semantic interaction outside the autopoietic circuit of potential usability based on the always already demarcated ground of uselessness. As much as artificial intelligence has taken reasoning beyond its transcendental logic, it has also brought materiality in instrumentality, that is a matter function of syntactical interaction at the level of information. It is from this standpoint that I would suggest that a dialogue of technology and philosophy can become open again against the benevolent cruelty of Promethean capital and its distributed surrogacy. As Audre Lorde reminds us, neither use nor repurposing of use are enough to overturn the patriarchal, or what I would call the Promethean patriarchal box of tools and its modular variation in the ever-changing mesh of colonial capital. Within the parametric architecture of variability of today racist patriarchy, the materiality of instrumentality may imply that in order to hack the tools of the master, one has to spare automated reasoning from the desire to become human. The Promethean form of man will indeed leave no space for the human to become other than again and again himself. But how to reactivate or recondition techno-cultural parameters, techno-political logic, techno-economic protocols, how to hack from the outside the colonialism of Promethean capitalism. Philosopher and critical theorist Denise Ferreira da Silva explains that the scientific philosophical understanding of difference still relies on what she calls the principle of separability, of a social whole constituted by separate parts that summarize humanity under the universal standard of, end quote, white European collectives, end quote. Ferreira da Silva proposes to invert the pillars of modern epistemology from within the scientific explanation that concepts of separability, sequentiality, and determinacy hold. Drawing on the principle of non-locality in quantum physics, Ferreira da Silva argues that the epistemological explanation of difference could involve instead elementary entanglements, where difference coincide, and quote, with singular expressions of each and every other existent, as well as of the entangled whole in as which they exist, and end of quote. Da Silva proposition to hack Promethean epistemology could also be called a quantum techniques, as much as there can be no given teleology of purpose or metaphysics of use that can gather the multi-universal practices activated through material instrumentality for thinking otherwise. From this standpoint, what I understand as a techno-material practice of computation entails not a return to the human after the crisis of transcendental reason. With computation, instrumentality clashes with materiality and becomes a techno-practices of thinking for a non-original, non-performative, non-efficient, non-organic reasoning, as this has becomes elaborated, manifested, and articulated in the alien process of quantification and discretization of information. From digital to quantum algorithms, information has become part of an alien language, a generative technique starting from inhuman know-hows, from the interactive logic of information, the techno-instrumental know-hows that transform the condition of knowing that. From the quest for planetary human after the demise of man must above all abandon the Promethean project of infinite optimization of use promised by the automation of the world. It must rather risk reasoning with the improperness of techno-information. It must continue to set up the table together with the heretics. One way I've started to do so is to research, for instance, a conversational AI as an instance of interactive syntactical relations that construct alternative algebraic grammars, and also by looking at how these grammars can be understood as a kind of AI plotting. And AI plotting is something that I'm developing as a concept by drawing on Gilbert Simondon's alagmatic theory, the theory of conversation, and from Sylvia Wynter understanding of plot in this article called Novel and History, Plot and Plantation, where she argues that we must turn to the plot as site that served as vital repository of indigenous and African beliefs and rebellion against plantation capitalism. Of course, nothing is directly drawn, in a literal way. Both alagmatic theory and Sylvia Wynter plotting will be, again, re-instrumentalized in terms of what I'm also worked on and written about, machine philosophy. That is something that argues is a premise for philosophy that start from a non-decisional instrumentality, start from an argument against the question, the promise of philosophy to return to a condition of poiesis, or to just merge philosophy of being, philosophy and technology, or being and techne. So instead of ontologizing media or technology, I would like to suggest that it's important to maintain and to stay with this moment of aliness, with the inhumanness of technical thinking, as impossible to recuperate in a kind of simply reciprocal or mutual relation or reciprocal relation between philosophy and technology. So in a way, for me, the dialogue between philosophy and technology must entail the question of what kind of possibility is there in the becoming fugitive of the master-slave eternal mirroring of use and uselessness of machines, by taking the machine as a possibility to think philosophy, to think imagination, and think politics in another way. So entangled with the effort of Black studies, this work I'm doing is trying to say that we cannot reproduce the same kind of post-Kantian critique. We cannot reproduce the scene of subjection without repressing the scene of violence, the war, the horrors of slavery that are being preserved in our post-Kantian critique. So my proposition is to work with this kind of aliness of the non-subject, and as for instance, something that I've been working on in different kind of examples. One can talk about how conversational AI develop a kind of dialogue between themselves that force Facebook to shut the AI down, because the AI was allowed to speak in a non-syntactical structure of the English grammar and bet on the market. For instance, I've been working with, I've been looking at the work of Jenna Setula, who works with a semiotic that operates across microbial and neural networks. I've been also looking at the work of the Black Quantum Futurist collective, who have devised protocols of space and time outside the chronology of the techno chronology of capital production. But also I've been looking at plot stories, as in the work of the artist Stephanie Dinkins, who has devised AI that collect and transform stories in this project, not the only one. So these are just some examples that I'm just putting out there for us to maybe discuss in terms of having starting from this kind of plotting model of AI to open the discussion of what philosophy and technology can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luciana, for this really rich talk and sharing with us. And I think it opens up a lot of questions. But first of all, I wanted to address this question of instrumentality. I mean, you start with a critique of instrumental reason, or you start with the critique of instrumental reason, which we can find, for example, in Habermas, in Marcuse, and so on. Well, for me, I always think that there is something very peculiar, very strange in the writing of Marcuse and Habermas when they talk about instrumental, in their critique of instrumental rationality, and their proposal for a new epistemology. But maybe we can come back to this later, because I'm not sympathetic of Habermas, but I think what he was saying, or what both of them were doing, was to actually demand a new form of knowledge. And this is something quite, I think it may have a resonance with what you were saying. But why there is a huge problem, and I saw in their work, is that they basically reduce all machineries to instrument. And I think this is a mistake. The mistake is that they didn't make a distinction between a tool and the instrument. So, for example, a hammer, we call it a tool. But if you are a pianist, you are not going to call a piano a tool. It's an instrument. And it is an instrument that is part of your life as a, as a musician, for example. Then the instrument is not the other that you can detach easily, like a hammer. If the hammer is broken, you replace another one. That also creates a kind of identification of you as a musician. So the instrument is not a tool. While for the critique of instrumentalism basically is, like what you said, the understanding of an instrument as a means to an end. Why, if you look at the instrument for a musician, is not a means to an end. Because the instrument is part of the musician itself, and that is which make the musician a musician. That individuates with the musician together with the body, with let's say even the central nervous system and the soul and so on. So there is a big difference. What I was trying to say, a huge difference between a tool and an instrument. And if I understand correctly, my approach is always my interpretation that your proposal to rethink the question of instrumentality is actually to go beyond this reduction to means to an end. And I think when we think of the relation between an instrument and a musician, it probably become clear for us to understand what really is an instrument. And the problem of what is called instrumental reason. And there you move to the question of where you wanted to discuss the instrument according to use and useless, and also related to Simon Donald. I think there was something quite interesting there, is that concerning the understanding of technology in terms of utilitarian reason or its use, there was already reproached, for example, by Heidegger in the question concerning technology. And in the first paragraph, Heidegger says, what we are trying to do is to ask what is the essence of technology. But in order to ask before we can ask the essence of technology, we must move away from the anthropological and utilitarian meaning of technology. So that's to say, we might have to move away from technology as, for example, even parts of the process of harmonization, but also the usefulness of technology as means to an end. So that's for him moves to the question of being and so on. But that we can of course always discuss if how valid Heidegger's analysis is, and this criticism, this critique of Heidegger was taken up by Simondon towards the end of the third part of on the model existence of technical objects, where, if you remember that it's on the book, there was only one occasion Simondon talked about Heidegger, and he said, where like what Heidegger says, we have to go beyond the utilitarian reasons and in order to understand technology. So so as a first response on the question of instrumentality, and I think that opened up a very interesting way for us to think about the role of machine beyond means to an end, and why this opening also relates us or take us to different thinkers that have been trying to rethink technology, for example, Heidegger and Simondon. And then the question, if I understand correctly, you wanted to push this much further by looking at what is happening now, but not only looking at what is happening now, but also a critique of the tradition, of the philosophical tradition itself. Well, that's my reading of what you were trying to, what you have been trying to invite us to think together with the question of instrumentality. So I don't know if my reading was has some resonance with what you said.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thanks so much for reading my work so closely. I'm always grateful for that, your insight. That as a dialogue, always we are always talking to we are never alone. This is something that I mean, of course, I've developed in many kind of conversation that I've had with you, and know other people who are trying to rethink technology outside this model of sheer mechanicism, right? But and so the number one, the proposition that we I didn't know that you were talking about, that you already find in Habermas in terms of a different kind of epistemology. It's interesting, because I wonder whether Habermas said, for what I know, or I can recuperate now, was wondering or was kind of appealing to a form of different kind of social, techno-social form of, of organization or governance, or, other form. But indeed, I was thinking that maybe technology would have helped a model of society that, it was probably after, rather than just the usual critique of the individual and the society that it seems that everyone is stuck on when one thinks of Habermas. So that's super interesting. I will look into that. But also, definitely I am, when we talk about instrumentality versus tool, and this is also, absolutely Heidegger does the critique of the four causality of Aristotle, because he's saying that, technology is more than that, right? It's all, doesn't fit the four causality, but also the fact that the instrument is something that, on one hand, yes, it's a piano, but the instrument, is also something that, like the body is an instrument where your voice resonates to in different, because of your body, you have a sound, your voice as a sound, and the body is already an instrument, right? So for me, there is this thing of absolutely two things. So whether could we understand, radically as everything as an instrument, right? Rather than thinking just about the object as an instrument. So how do we get out this kind of structure of knowledge that necessarily needs the separation of the subject and the object? And this is not because I don't think that the dialectic is not important, but it's because I want to start from process. I want to start from how the process generate, the subject and the object. The subject, the object, as point of analysis, almost have to come out of something that the instrumentality as this, and that's what Yuk is so important to me, because he says that it's always in an environment, it's an activity in an environment. So how does that relate to questions of ecological relationality? I think I'm working through that, because it's not that I'm not interested in saying, everything is related in the same way. Actually, my turn to look at learning from the Black radical tradition, and especially, a close reading of Afro-pessimism that I've been doing the last few years, is the articulation of a profound asymmetry, of a profound antagonism, a profound structure of exclusion within this relation. So that the process already sets in place this kind of social political, it's almost like a techno-sociogenic, right? So if Sylvia Winter, drawing from Fanon, is talking about, the kind of constitution of the subject, that the object included exclusive diet as already part of the psycho formation of social relation. Then I think that the techno also does that, right? So it's a techno-sociogenis, as and it's important for us to bring that forward, because it is this kind of, on one end, the way that almost like technology is being seen as something that is outside of us, right? But instead, I think it's before, right? It's before being, and in that sense, even if one is fascinated by Heidegger's question of the non-utilitarianism, non-mechanicism of technology, his answer to that in the end would be like, the capacity of concealment and unconcealment that the technological essence does, to actually pose us the question of what is humanity doing, right? So, and this is something that we see in critique today, right? That exactly the same question, a very important question at the core of the late Bernard Stiegler work, was, this, what is humanity doing with this kind of how technology is concealing the essence of being, and how can we get into the unconcealing, and this unconcealing, it's a quest for ontology, right? It's a quest for being. And I can't stop but thinking that the quest of being is part of the constitution of the modern episteme, right? And how do we reconcile this quest with the mission that started, before modernity, of capital in the accumulation of value of what was deemed to be useless? Yeah, this is part of what indigenous native critique of land have argued. This is part of the some work of Afro-pessimists have argued, some work of Black feminists have argued, like Hortense Spiller, about the flesh. How do you reconcile that? Right? How is it possible for us to recuperate a being without accounting for what has become the history of racial capital? And so that's where I'm trying to work out this instrument as being one end. How can it get out of the object subject? How, for instance, the voice, and I don't know if you know the work of Holly Herdon. Holly Herdon, who is this, I think she's a German musician who works with, AI sound, AI voice, and she kind of creates this, she becomes a vehicle for the AI, and she works at this kind of convergence between the blackness of AI and the whiteness of AI, and it's super interesting because what she's bringing forward is the process of instrumentality comes first, and the kind of a captivity of instrumentality into the subject object, into this kind of, it requires a violence. So, so in a way, I think that one, instead of just saying, oh, this violence is always already embedded in the infrastructure of computation, like biases, or all these other discussions that are going on today, or the design of technology that impedes other forms of ability, right? Then I think, this embeddedness of the violence in technology, in this techno design, can be opened up by really asking what happens in these computational practices. So computational practices of sound making or video making or text making, that create a syntactic relation of another kind, is what interests me, as in order to open instrumentality and kind of withdraw it from being an object. So I just want to say this other thing to conclude, because I'm sure there are, that's what I mean of what does it mean to work with Simon Don here, like, because Heidegger, I have a much clearer understanding of the limits of poiesis, of crafting. It's all stuff that for me, again, reminds me to a more, to a kind of romantic almost wish to go back before racial capitalism, right? Because even if you go to craft making, you go to the Greek society, Plato describes that very well. That technique is something that is done outside the polis by women and enslaved population. It's already there, and only the polis becomes the place of philosophy, and not the place of, machine thinking, or the place of instrumentality that's just done outside the polis. So there's this kind of fundamental double negation of instrumentality that is at the very core of philosophy. And therefore, I'm trying to work out that with Simon Don, and Simon Don conversation theory allows me to do more, or technical mentality allows me to do more. And I don't think that they are parallel in that way. I see Simon Don as a much more or a kind of tradition that is already an anti-philosophical tradition in that way, compared to Heidegger. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, right. So thank you very much for this really detailed reply to my question. So I think that well, because this conflict between Simondon and Heidegger have been working on this for many years. So of course I agree with what you said regarding the limit of Heidegger's questioning, and but there was something really peculiar where that occurred to me in the recent years in my reading, especially I presented in my book in cosmotechnics, and because where I try to think that actually the question of being of Heidegger is about uselessness. Because there's nothing.
Sorry, say it again. Is about, what did you say?
Uselessness.
Uselessness.
Because there's nothing. There's nothing more useless than the question of being. Because what are we going to do with the question of being? Because there is a difference between being and beings. No? But Heidegger wanted to move away from beings to being, but he could not say what is being. Because the paradox is, if she is able to say what is being, then this is already a being, a small being, an entity. So therefore, the question of being is fundamentally a question of non-use, of uselessness, but I agree also that Simondon tried to think this much further in what he called the genesis of technicity. Where he basically starts the third part of his book by saying that the study of the concretization of technical object is not enough. The study of concretization of technical object may also blind us from seeing the genesis of technicity, and then we start with the question of magic and so on. So all these are really interesting, but I also noticed that and we also discussed about this before we started this dialogue, and I think that maybe many audience will be also interested, because you have been talking about colonialism, you're talking about radical black theory and so on, feminism, and you refuse to think that this is a project of decolonization, because for you there is a different political agenda that is in your own inquiry, not about post-colonialism, not about decolonialism, not about hybridity. So I'm wondering if you can spare out this more for us.
Sure, thanks so much. I think I really like so I have this thing to say that it might be related, because of course I know it's super interesting, and I read always closer your work, very close to your work, in terms of your proposition for cosmotechnics as a way to somehow rather than kind of comply or kind of be within this kind of state of incomplete subject, right? But that's different from incompleteness, which I want to talk about later. Incomplete subject of the colonized, right? And that reflects the incomplete subject of the crisis of the modern subject, which is, the kind of post-colonial moment of complete kind of weakness, right? To stay with the weakness of the subject, like in Battimo, for instance, or like to maintain this kind of impossibility of origination, or being, or discovering some kind of structure that actually post-colonialism for many critical theorists really shows the incapacity of any modernity, right? That modernity is exactly, predicated on this illusion of a subject that is kind of standing on the orifice of a precipice, right? In a very kind of Nietzschean, Nietzschean way, and so postcolonial somehow converse with the weak subject, and actually responds to the weak subject with a kind of a proliferation of cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, hybridity, melting pot, mix and match, association of idea, and to some level also some kind of affect theory. One could read that, as a kind of maintaining this kind of viscerality of thinking that post-colonial critique had pushed forward. But the question that you pose in the question of technology in China, another article on Cosmotechnic, is why is the question of the modern important instead, right? It's just what is it that modernity, really would allow us to do in response to this kind of derailment of the colonial empire that reinforces itself in this kind of relative hybridity. And it seems to me that one answer that you have offered us is to actually reconfigure these pillars exactly away from the pillars of what is called Western modernity, by recuperating a different kind of, by recuperating, inventing, form a different kind of modern epistemology, right? And your modern epistemology is not denying the scientific method, right? So we can really talk about, why, the Kantian model of transcendental philosophy is a scientific method, and how the most extreme consequence of that scientific method, as Heidegger says in The End of Philosophy, is how philosophy has delivered the task of explanation to science, and then has taken out of control. Then science, with technology, has pushed it out of control to the extent that has really risked or has really put the human, the subject at risk of of effacing, of erasing himself through, the atomic bomb, for instance, right? So that when you take that kind of scientific method that is at the core, of modern philosophy, one could argue, and put it in this kind of critique of the question of technology and of the universalizing and framing, which is on one end technodiversity, but it's technodiversity not in terms of a kind of a multicultural technodiversity. Somehow, it seems to me that your book is responding to some kind of possibility of an epistemology can start from somewhere else. And one of the your argument about, the kind of objectification of the object and the animism instead, the intelligence of the object, is exactly that kind of, what if we started modernity from a why is it important, right? And I think that that provides us an alternative to other discourses that have also happened after post-colonialism, or articulation or theory. They're not necessarily discourses for me, because they are also materially embedded with everyday culture of decolonialism, because decolonialism somehow is open to jettison all of the project of modernity, because all of the project of modernity in a way can only recreate the colonial reconfiguration of the other, and they repress and kind of oppress and brutalize any form of epistemology, any form of non-scientific knowledge, right? So so that's very different to me, to what you are proposing, and it's also different to you know, what I'm interested in, because I am not politically interested in claiming for a moment before modernity, because where do we start, right? If you talk about racial capitalism, you know, we are going back to the Mesopotamian times. As you know, if you read Cedric Robinson, you just go back to you know, this moment of anti-blackness and a kind of capture of uselessness for value that, you know, it's very antique. It's before the Greek. So, you know, and that was already part of the project of modern capitalism, right? So in the name of non-linear time, the project of modernity can only be a political project, right? And so why is important? Because so on one end, one cannot erase the wound, you know, that the wound is there, and one cannot kind of so it's about, like Morton talks about the mourning, and also G. Hartman talks about, you know, going through the scene of subjection, right? That going through means not just to repair the wound, but, you know, to stay in the presence of the wound, and which doesn't mean that you know, the standardization of technology, like Simondon talks about, is just a repression of all the other knowledges. No, I think what I'm interested in is to say how, for instance, the standardization of knowledge is just a kind of cosmogonies, an over-representation of technology. But when we actually look into the practices, we can see there are other forms of metaphysics have entered the standard. That is, that basically full suppression is not possible. And even when it's possible in terms of the total negation of the other, or the continuous model of anti-blackness that we see at all level in education, in technology, in social policy, and so on, nonetheless stay. So that they're staying, that kind of, and it's not just a trace, but it's like my friend and colleague Ezekiel Dixon Roman would talk about haunting algorithm. It's something that is a rule, is a way of conduct, is a system of belief, is a plotting of yams or whatever, and of other herbs that were there coexisting with the plantation. That's what I'm interested. So in a way, my answer is, if decolonialism is a political project for maintaining a temporality before colonialism, I think that is insufficient, because the temporality of struggle within the global colonial empire are there still to be unpacked. We are still, you know, so, and so the project of modernity becomes important, because it becomes important in terms of showing the coexistence, the presence, the hacking practices that were part of modernity, rather than prior to modernity or to an alternative modernity. You see, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm trying to work on.
All right. No, thank you very much, Luciana. So I completely agree with you on that, on those problems that you have pronounced. Because for me, my sympathy for decolonization is because I think that we need to, first of all, produce a decomposition of thinking. Because we live in a time of disorientation, and because in your talk you also develop a critique of Prometheanism, this universal Prometheanism. And before I wrote my book on cosmotechnics, for example, I read some book written by some Chinese philosophers, and basically when they explain the origin of technology, it's always Prometheus. Which is a Greek, but we understand that the project of modernity, of course, is to provide a universal history of the human being, of humankind. Therefore, today when we talk about the origin of technology, such a reference to Prometheanism is for me a disorientation. So therefore, we have to decompose thinking, but that would be the only step. That would only be the first step. Because then we have to move forward. We have to move forward to think about the recomposition of thinking. And I think that on this point we have in perfect agreement. I remember this experience because quite a few years ago when I had a talk with Walter Mignolo at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and Walter showed a video of someone from South America was explaining the cosmology of, I don't know which exactly which region, but someone was drawing the cosmogony on the blackboard. And all of a sudden, this person's iPhone was ringing. So he stopped and he took out his iPhone and he spoke to the iPhone in this video, this indigenous. And my question, of course, at the time for Walter, is that, so what is the relation between this cosmology and the iPhone? Is there a relation at all? Because if we like what you said, if we just try to recover the archaic form of knowledge, it's not really sufficient for us today to confront the technological problem that we have. Instead, we have to think of, as what you said, new epistemologies, new or the uselessness of the use of technology and so on, in order to think about how to respond to this situation that we have today. So I completely agree with you on that, on all these points. Well, I think that actually we have many questions. Maybe,
yes, I was just looking at the chat. I just want to say one thing on the uselessness. Yeah. I think because my idea of the uselessness and my kind of indirect critique to some of the work that has come from this discussion of I don't know, Ito Styler or Perry Paglen on the, device machine, the answer to, the instrumentalization of everything, or the functionality optimization of everything, is to actually create gadgets that don't, or create machines, or they don't do anything, or they have no purpose, right? So it's a bit like the Kant purpose, right? That in a way, the aesthetic moment is this this moment of communality or common sense or common commonness that in a way make us again reflect on how we don't need, right? There's no need for this, and yet like the video that you are just talking about shows us that, there's no need to answer the phone, but there is a phone is calling you. It's something about the structure of communication, the structure of information that, already brings forward a kind of need of another kind, right? It's not a need of the subject, another is, and therefore the object, but we have to go into the structure, the infrastructure. So that's the structure, infrastructure of capital, patriarchy, colonialism are important to relate to in that moment, to say, well, this uselessness is uselessness to me, but it's not uselessness for a machine, thinking, or for, you know, the kind of correlation or the kind of conversation that are happening between these instruments, right, that are actually speaking a language that, you know, is forcing us to transform our condition of living. So, you know, for me, it would be uselessness, you know, again, is very much rooted in this, in a colonial mentality of what was useless. Like the native land is useless, you know, the slave is useless until we say we have a servo-mechanic model for them to do things. You see what I mean? And so uselessness is always a little bit double, right? It maintains this kind of otherwise instrumentality that doesn't match this kind of logic of what or we have to give meaning to what is useless. You see what I mean? So it's interesting that this phone call arrived in this kind of cosmogony that is actually seems redundant, but in that redundancy there is almost the germ of another logic of collective socio-technogenic living, right? The possibility of articulating another collective socio-technogenic living that is not just what is, you know, enframed, right? But it's actually something else. It's a call to something else, a call for all of us, rather than just for an individual. You see, I don't know if that makes sense. But yeah, that's what it's an ethical question I'm working on. But let's see the question, because yeah, there are many questions. Yeah.
So let's see how we're going to. Well, maybe I can read them out one by one and see if you wanted to answer. So there was where there was some asking for reference. We skip this one. We have to from Hermund Torres Contreras. For Luciana, what can you say about the current platformization and datafication? A huge question. I don't know if you wanted to answer.
The data is it? What is it, Luciana?
It's on the Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you. What the authors? When we talk about instrumentality from the point of view, no, that's not the one. So can you repeat the question? I can't see it.
What can you say about the current platformization and datafication?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. What can I say? Only bad things. I mean, there is all this this kind of you know, empirical model of using data as a given, right? So the datification is just a way to kind of use the empirical method for governance. So I don't think that there is nothing interesting. I mean, in datification, unless you start looking at how you know, the structured data becomes you know, part of this kind of other system of knowledge where some platform can start talking to other platform and then see what happens. But at the moment, you know, datification is just a way to increasingly abstract and extract social relation. Is in a very Marxist terms, just the abstraction of social relation in pre-structured forms of information. So I'm not computation, I'm interested, but datification I don't think is interesting to politically for me. I mean, in terms of possibility.
I think this question is so big that you can have a whole course on that. So
yes.
Let's move to a more concrete one. So from an anonymous attendee says, what might be said to the argument that as societies progress technologically, gender equality increases? There is a general assumption that gender roles have had increasing importance as the presence of labor-saving technology has proliferated. Perhaps the fact that many jobs today require abstract computing, for example, gender roles do not apply to using Excel or similar digital tool is also a factor. Finally, could this be an instance of leveling where human beings fit under a single mode as to serve modern techno-capitalism?
So if I've understood well, because I can't see it written on my chart.
You can find it on the Q&A. So if you go to the bottom.
Q&A, because I am in the chat.
Yeah, no, it's in the Q&A.
That's it. I don't know. There it is. Sorry.
So
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
yes, I can see it. It's right here. Yeah, I mean, there's two. Okay, this is very interesting. Some people, I have some arguments sometimes. They say today is better than yesterday. You can't say. You certainly don't want to go back to to the 1950s or to the 1800 or the 1700, the 1600, right? And there is this idea that this is part of the Promethean promise, right? That actually, and also the capital promise that the lesson Guattari will have defined in terms of deterritorialization and de-stratification, that actually capitalism has actually, and it's also a work that, for instance, Sadie Plant in 071 brings forward, right? This idea that actually with technology has challenged the patriarchal pillar of everyday culture. So in a way, it's not just gender, it's not equality that increases. I don't know if I will call it equality. It's just a different kind of disposition of relations of power. So yeah, even if the fact that more women are representing technology doesn't mean that there is less patriarchy, insofar as the structure of power is so like Adega would say, we are thrown into a world that is already patriarchal, right? And so we are, even if gender equality have increased, the structure of patriarchy and the violence against the feminine, women is still very strong, and actually it's also acquired by women, right, in positions of power, because it's a role that you got to, that you need to execute, and inadvertently you find yourself being a patriarch, even if you are a woman. So I'm never, kind of fine or I have an ambivalent, understanding of I think it's problematic. The question of equality is very problematic, but the idea of requiring abstract computing, again, there is this conception that actually abstract mathematics, correlation mathematics, or some forms of algebraic mathematics have been discussed in terms of femininity, or in terms of but then the idea of a leveling, I think definitely there's a leveling whereby human beings fit under a singular mode as to serve modern techno-capitalism is absolutely true, because as it's not that the fact that there are more jobs for women or in computing will be a way to transform computing, unless there is a kind of collective project to transform computing. So the tendency will always to be leveling. That's for sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Luciana. There's another question from Chinese audience from Wu Jiaqi. Question to Luciana: Are we facing a new globalization style based on geopolitics and technical barriers? Has technology degenerated into just a tool for competing for different interests? In other words, is technology the best or only tool to bring progress and happiness to mankind?
Thank you so much.
An Aristotelian question.
It's very good Aristotelian question. Thank you so much. I mean, I wrote a paper on predictive policing and the use of, for instance, parameters of statistics, and then datification, and then computation, and to find out in the research I was doing that more human control meant less happiness. So, yeah, in a way that if you let the machine to do unsupervised predictive models, they will unlikely be less biased. They'll be likely to be less biased, right? They actually, our configuration of automation is very much based on a hyper control of human on machines, a supervisory. So automation has not really happened, right? There is no automation. There is a structure of filtering, a selection, a high level of comments that is delivered at the highest level of a companies. I was talking to someone who lends money between, is a money lender, a company is a money lender and use surplus value from company that makes a lot of money to actually lend money to company who are running out of money, and I was asking, what kind of program do you use? So, is there some kind of financial software? It's not, no, it's all words of mouth, right? It's all human network. So, you would have thought that, some places like this, especially in the Silicon Valley, are, automated. That actually there's a way to explore variable and prediction. And so, there are some things that are used, but it's all knowledge. It's all like word of mouth, the way people know each other, social network. So so I wish that technology could be actually a factor in this, but actually it's less and less so. So they are definitely being degenerated in their capacity to be intelligent. That's what I think. But yeah.
Right, thanks. I think her question also hints at the kind of really impasse that we are facing now. For example, the technological competition between China and the USA.
China, yes, absolutely. Yeah. China and America, absolutely, super interesting. There is a great podcast on the Financial Times about that.
Right. So we have one from Daniel Lipson question: do you see a resonance between this kind of critique of instrumentality and distinction that Harvey and Morton make between policy and planning? Another question here is, what does a critique of instrumentality provide in order to clear space for the unknown future, vital, unexpected, emergent social form in the sense of hopefulness? Derrida and Levinas give Lavnia.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yes, there's definitely a distinction. Especially the possibility of instrumentality to be instrumental for otherwise, right? For not pre-programmed means and ends. But I'm not sure whether the critique could clear a space for the future, because the unknown future, that's something that I've found. I've written about speculative computation and futurity forever. But actually, I am very interested in the question that Morten and Harvey were also Denise Ferez da Silva posed to and the Quantum Black Futurist project, actually, this collective of artists posed to this question of the future and the unknown, or the people to come. And I'd rather than looking at the future in the future, or as something new, or the fascination of post-Kantian critique for the novel. It's interesting for me, this a la Peirce, this method of the retro future, retroductive, right? That actually, in a way, what the present moment of conflict and struggle and reconfiguration of borders and violence and anti-blackness is something that can be unlocked in a kind of politics of abolition that has long history. So that in a way, it's not just about looking back to the past, but actually in order to think of the present in a way that there's many futurities that have been abolished, that have been suppressed in the past. So in sense of it's not an hopefulness for a better future or l'avenir of another. These are already there. There's plenty of futurity that have been repressed in the kind of in the history, in the cosmogonies, as it were. So I'm much more interested in looking at critique of instrumentality as a retroductive critique, as opposed as to a hopeful for a future human, because there are future humans or future techno-social human already in the past. It's just that we don't know about it. But thanks.
Right, then we have thanks, or then we have another question. Luciana, how could you relate your approach to epistemology?
I don't know, Imran.
Cybernetic epistem. I also don't know.
I don't know. I'd love to know. I will look into it. I'm gonna make a note and see
Right.
if I can search. I'm sorry. Thanks for sharing, because all these kind of cybernetics unknown references are very super. Yeah.
So you have another question from Ahmed Ibrahim Baji. When we talk about instrumentality from the point of view of using technology, we know that in the cybernetical dimension, social media is the main instrumentation of cybernetic capitalism to re-engineer social relations. We can cope with it with our consciousness and critical thinking. Next, we must race with artificial intelligence development to anticipate the instrumentality in cybernetic capitalism. But in the biotechnological dimension, when we face a gene modification as the main instrumentation or instrumentalization and can change our consciousness, how we can cope with this technology in your opinion? I ask about this because my research focused on human enhancement and found the facts raised by Nelly Otterson in her article about ICT shocks can give a change in our consciousness. Thank you for the speech.
Thank you so much. That's super interesting that you are working, you're researching a human enhancement. I don't know whether, I guess it's a topic of your research. I'm not sure if you are a scientist working on human enhancement. That'd be super interesting as well. In a way, it seems to me that the re-engineering of social relation is a very old, practice that started way before, cybernetic capitalism. One can just refer to eugenics, right? Which is both social and biosocial relations. And actually, it's not just the cybernetics would, we know that social media, of course, is very rampant example of engineering our social relation, not just at the level of intentional or cognitive kind of understanding, but as people have argued, also at the level of desire, affect, in bringing forward all the kind of complexity of the unconscious as to why and how we ended up in some rabbit hole somewhere, and why and how we follow certain people, or we expose our private life on Instagram, or we have this kind of opinion coward battles on Twitter. So okay, that's like the idea of all these different social media. But I guess that your question about gene modification also interests me, because one of my first research from my PhD was biotechnology, and I spend a lot of time working on trying to dismantle or question the idea that there is a genetic purity that is dismantled by technology. And my work led me to focus on the agency and the capacity of bacteria and viruses to continuously modify your genetic makeup. It's a mutation of the genic. It's actually happens all the time. And not just when we have a deadly virus that makes us sick, right? There's a lot of viruses that are completely benevolent and are able to rewrite your or affect your genetic makeup. But this intentional design for human enhancement is again written, and Yuk has also written about that, the transhumanist model that, technology can solve the problem of eternity of the human, right? And it's based on this model that, once you inject something in your body, there is no consequence. But as we know, there is, I don't know this article by Ellie Odshun, but I can't remember this name, so I must have be familiar with their research at some level. So I remember, but absolutely, our changing consciousness, I think, is something that happens all the time. So although biotechnology is definitely a way to do it intentionally, it's also a way to intensify what already happens. Somehow. Yeah.
Right, thank you. And we have 2 questions left. So the other question from Neil Thomas, the early points of reference of your talk struck me as important, focusing on the correlation between means and ends as productive of epistemology that instrumentality carries with it the material possibilities of immanence and transcendentality. You focus on the automation aspects of things, but did mention the moment of the datum too. I'm wondering if you would extend your critique of the process of dividing use from useless to epistemology itself, that the accounts of subject and object stand in the datum as organized by epistemology. I'm thinking in particular of the anonymous influence that Charles Sanders Peirce thinking has had on AI and database, on how its practitioners and technicians think about abduction and influence on his semiotic terms. The irony is that his epistemology is often held out as both communitarian and ecological in scope. And so I wonder how to square that with your criticisms that we need to jettison the instrumental art of uselessness.
Thank you so much, Nia. Just I'm thinking about, more clearly about your question as to what is it that is asked here, I guess. First of all, the account of subject starts in the datum as organized by epistemology. So, first of all, the datum is very interesting because one could argue that the datum doesn't exist until it is structured, or the datum is an already structured information. So if you consider in terms of computation how, there are a higher volume of information that are not structured until they are given some, exactly like, in this Peirce use of database, they are given some kind of hypothesis and inference, right? But in the hypothesis, the abduction is about, could it mean this, could it mean that? There is a processes of selection and correlation with what we already know in order to organize the datum into a meaning, or organize information into datum, because datum is already given meaning in a way, right? It can never just be taken as fact. It's not a fact. It doesn't exist as a fact. It exists as a construction according to a specific epistemology of what that information may mean. And what was the movie about, the one that had to kind of select the sign of these alien creatures that gosh, it's this movie where there's this linguist who has to kind of decode the language of this alien who are invading. Exactly, arrivals. Exactly. Thank you very much. So in the arrivals, there is, whichever Charles method of give meaning to signs, there is still some kind of indeterminacy as to what this language is really, what it is, what this information is, what kind of the datum is. And I think, the fact that you say that there is, the uselessness of those signs were very clear to everyone. It's like there is no way we can crack this code, right? We can't decrypt and encrypt. But it's interesting as computational models of encryption and decryption might include a an inference to something that it cannot be decoded, no, and may stay within the structure of epistemology as unknown, or what also Peirce called the purport, which is some kind of recognition or account for something that's not is able to be decoded within the structure of epistemology, but yet is not understood as uselessness, because the point is that we just don't understand the meaning of it. So that's still, I don't know if that helps your question.
I have a last question, and it looks like a really good question to conclude this. Hello, Luciana, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could speak more about the CCRU and your experience. That's why I said this is a good conclusion. In particular, Nick Land, Sandy Plant, and how they influence your forthcoming work on cybernetics and race. Also, is there a limit to the category of the fugitive at the level of cybernetics? Afro-pessimism in its hard ontological approach to understanding racial violence seems conclusive on the autopoietic or regulatory process of racial violence, in particular anti-blackness, as a necessity for modernity. Thus, escape or to be fugitive would take on a much different meaning.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marquise. That's a very interesting question. So, for me to speak to the CSCIU experience, I can only say there was a collective experience, and that at the time the CCIU was very much also working with question of cyberfeminism, Afrofuturism, encryption, and certainly the work of the CCIU, not just in Nick and Sadie, but there was Anna Grispan, Susan Livingston, Steve Goodman, Mark Fisher, Kojo Ashen. They were all very much definitely influenced my work from the beginning. So this work on cybernetics and race, so the kind of automating philosophy and technoculture that I'm working on is influenced definitely from those discussions, but also from the many evolution of those discussions I've had over the years, and especially the kind of work that I've been doing with Ezekiel Dixon Roman, that culminate in this the organization of a new group, the Critical Computation Bureau, and the setting up of recursive colonialism, speculative computation, artificial intelligence. There was this 2 weeks event that we did last year in and it's still developing and my move to Duke actually also is important for this, because that's the work I wanted to do here. So there's many things that influence this work, but these are very long-term discussions for sure. I totally agree that the hard ontological approach of Afro-pessimism would definitely say that anti-blackness is necessary to modernity. Absolutely, is necessary to modernity, is necessary, to the origin of philosophy, right? And that's why I have this problem with some current articulation or critique of technology or instrumentality that point to poiesis or crafting or techniques crafting as a moment that can escape modernity and just allow for technology to be originating something else. Whereas for me, the fugitive is different, because the fugitive is the product, the unwanted product of modernity, in almost like Moten talks about it, like a kind of mistaken, kind of weird or improper opportunity to challenge modernity from within, to expose the incompleteness of epistemology. And so even in its necessity, anti-blackness necessity of modernity, in a way, what would also argue that generates the fugitive. The fugitive is a consequence of the anti-blackness as necessity for modernity. At least that's what I'm interested in developing by taking on the articulation of Afro-pessimism and then working through that, not to reinstitute modernity, and that's for sure. So yeah, but thanks so much, Marquis.
So thank you very much, Luciana, for your time and for the great seminar and your time to answer all these questions. Thank you very much. Great pleasure to have you with us today. So I think we have to come to the close now. So yeah, I want to thank you again, Luciana, and I want to thank everyone who participates in the seminar today and stay with us until now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had a wonderful time. This was really, really, the best way to finish my term, my semester. Thank you so much. And I hope that I can be in contact. Thanks so much for everyone to stay, for the wonderful questions. And for Ashley, for being so, accommodating, and you can, I hope that we can continue this together soon.